In this lecture, we will be looking at the introduction to Kleiner's Art Through the Ages, A Global History, Volume 2. At this point, you should have already read the Before 1300 section. This is just a section for those of you who have not had Art 105 yet, which is the prehistoric up to the Renaissance. Gives you a general, very generalized summary of what art was like before the Renaissance. Well, what we're going to do here in the introductory lecture, again, these lectures are meant to supplement the readings. You still need to be doing the readings, and you're responsible for all materials within the readings. But the lectures here are meant to focus on specific ideas and then expand in some of the ideas. So first, to start with, what is art history? What does that even mean? Most of us have taken history classes in the past. History is seen as the record and the interpretation of past human events, particularly social and political events. So if we discuss World War II, we're talking about an event that occurred in history. Now, art, on the other hand, is usually seen somehow as part of the present. When we think about art, we think of some sort of tangible objects, meaning some physical thing that we can see, we can touch. So what is art history? Art history is a combination of these two things. It's where we are looking at the objects, yet we're also looking at the historical context that surrounds the work. Now, art history is different from art appreciation. If you've taken Art 100, that is more of an introduction to art. And what art appreciation does is this is where we are looking at how and why we value a work of art. And usually this is based only on the object itself, looking at the elements and principles of art and the different genres of art, meaning two-dimensional art, which includes painting, drawing, printmaking, and photography, and then sculpture, dance, film, music, architecture, and theater. That is art appreciation. We can go and watch a film and appreciate it for it being a piece of art without knowing the history around it. So what do we do in art history? Again, it requires the knowledge of the historical context. And we talk about context, we mean all the things that surround an artwork. The central aim of art history is to determine the original context of an artwork. Therefore, the study of history is vital to art history. We must know the history of the art and architecture. We have to know this art history, that history is inseparable from this. Okay, so to fully understand the context of a work, we have to understand what is happening around it. And you can see that in three of the examples here. Two are from your book and one I've added. So the work in the left-hand side, this is Ben Shon's The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti, 1931-32, tempera on canvas. Now, we could look at this work and appreciate it. We could appreciate it for its style, maybe for the colors that are being used, but to fully understand it through art history is we have to understand the context of what is going on. And within this work, there's a lot of political context. In fact, the work itself is even a type of political protest. Sacco and Vanzetti, many believed, were wrongly convicted of murder and then were executed because of this perceived murder. So this work, we would not understand that without knowing the context surrounding it. The image in the upper right-hand corner, many of you have probably seen this before. This is the very famous painting of the American Founding Fathers at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, historically, or art appreciation, we could look at this and again, appreciate the brushwork, right? That there's pretty much no discernible brush strokes, the fine line, the clear details, the realisticness within the work. But to fully understand it from an art historical point of view, we have to know what's going on. Who are these men? Why is this moment so important that it's being portrayed in this painting? And then the final one is one that your text talks about. This is Lorraine's embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, 1648, oil on canvas. Now with this, we can look at this and wonder what is going on. and again appreciate its beauty. But if we don't do some sort of historical research, we don't know if this is an event that actually took place or not. All right, another distinction that is often made in art is the difference between art and crafts, or fine art. Fine art is usually seen to have no true function or use. These are things such as painting and sculpture. And traditionally, fine art was what was considered art. Crafts, if you will, crafts usually have some sort of utilitarian purpose, meaning they have some use to them. This includes pottery, weaving, woodworking, metalwork, and even jewelry. And because it had some sort of use to it, right? If you take the image here on the right, you have all these pieces of pottery. Well, what's the purpose of a pitcher? A pitcher is to hold liquid to pour into something else. And often these crafts were looked at as lower art forms. However, in recent years, this perception has changed drastically, and many scholars now are looking at crafts as a type of art form. And you're going to see many people who will argue for that. These crafts often offer art historians a vast amount of information about a culture and a time period. All right, now I'm going to kind of jump to the end of the introduction section because I want to talk about this idea of different ways of seeing. Now, as we go through this course, I want you to think there is no one right way to look. We will be looking at different pieces of artwork, and we're going to look at them as art historians. Now, we may talk about them aesthetically, meaning looking at the study and nature of beauty and doing more of a formal analysis on them, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want you to realize, don't think just because I'm giving you one interpretation of a work that means it's the only interpretation or the right way. If you want to look at a work such as the Mona Lisa here on the left, and I ask you, what do you think it's about? And you think it's about puppies, well, that's fine. But you're going to have to be able to support your claim. And we all have different ways of seeing. The best art historians analyze artworks from many different viewpoints, meaning we look at who the artist was, we look at who the patron was, meaning who paid for it, the subject, the time period. We look at different cultures and their meanings before an artwork. We look at the symbolic use or symbols that are used within a work. And then we also take advantage of physical sciences, that we look to science to maybe help us date an object. We x-ray objects, especially paintings. Historically, canvases were not cheap, and many times canvases would be reused. By x-raying these, we can actually see if there are other works underneath. And as art historians and as humans, we also have to be aware that we bring our own baggage with us, that we can try to look at a work of art and be completely objective about it, but we have to realize that we all have our own cultural influences, ways that we have been taught, or even just our preconceived cultural notions. For example, if you're looking at the images here, if in today's society, if you saw a person who had a tattoo that completely covered their face, you may have some preconceived ideas of what that means about that individual. And this is the example that is used in the book. Okay? So technically, both works of art depict the same subject matter, but they were created by two very different people. And what this is a portrait of the 19th century Maori chieftain Te Pehi Q. Now, the first image that we have is the image on the left. This was created by John Henry Sylvester, who was an Englishman, and this was created in 1826, and it is a watercolor. Now, here you can see Sylvester was commissioned to paint a portrait of Te Pehi Q. And this is how he created him. Here he includes the head, the shoulders, and he actually kind of downplays the tattoo. Also, the chieftain is portrayed in English attire. And so very popular in English portraiture at this time was making people seem as realistic as possible, but also adding this sense of almost nobility to them. And so here we see Sylvester's own cultural influence influencing how he portrays the chieftain. Now, the image on the right is actually a self portrait by Tepehi-Q, also from 1826. And what is very interesting here is that he focuses only on the tattoo. And with this, it shows the importance of the tattoo to him. That basically the tattoo is his identity. He shows no other markers really except the pupils of his eyes. Why? Because for him, the tattoo is the most important thing because it shows his ranking. And interestingly enough, your book even mentions this, that Q actually did this drawing completely from memory. He did not even need to look into a mirror to know what the tattoo looked like. All right, next we're going to look at different questions that as art historians we should ask. The first one is, how old is it? Meaning, how old is the work of art? What we're being asked to do here is to date the work of art. This is what's called chronology, which means the dating of art objects and buildings. And I will state this, you're in the text, Kleiner often distinguishes between art objects and architecture or buildings. I do not make that distinction. I clearly see architecture as an art form. So when I talk about artworks, architecture for me is also included in that. All right, so when we look at something and we ask, how old is it? There's different ways we can do this. First off, we can look for physical evidence. And the biggest clue is look at materials used. So for instance, oil paints were actually not invented until the 1500s by Flemish artists. So if we're looking at a work of art and it's made with oil paints, we know that it cannot be before this time period. Or we can look at the materials that are being used. And for example, it's a type of material that is no longer used. Types of paper are very popular for this. In the early Renaissance in Italy, paper was actually made out of scraps of clothing. This was very expensive. And once paper actually became part of parchment made out of tree materials, it became much cheaper. And so we largely see the use of cloth as paper go away. So if we see cloth being used as paper, that also gives us some physical evidence of the time period a work might be made in. Also, we can use scientific tools that are available to us. Carbon dating, woodworking, we can usually look at the rings of a tree, and things such as this physical evidence which can help us place a work in time. Also very helpful is if there is any documentary evidence, meaning this is some sort of written documentation that accompanies a work of art. Whether maybe it's a contract between a patron and an artist, maybe when the artist signed a work, they also put a year on it, or if there's any kind of official records that go along with a work of art. Next, we have what's called internal evidence, meaning perhaps we have an identifiable person. So if we are looking at a painting of Henry VIII, King of England, well, we know this is not going to exist before Henry VIII existed. So that also gives us some type of information. Also, if we're looking at in a work, if we have a person, we can look at different types of hairstyle and clothing. This can give us a hint of the time period of a work. And again, this goes into stylistic evidence, and this is how an artist produces an object. Now, this is usually very subjective. Basically, it's kind of a guess. Meaning, if we say something is in the style of, for example, here, this is a Salvator Mundi, and this is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. However, there is no real evidence that da Vinci painted this. But because of all these different questions art historians ask and looking at the style of da Vinci, this has been attributed to him. The reason why I chose this artwork is this actually sold within the last couple of months, and it sold for $450.3 million with fees. And there is no solid proof that this was actually ever created by Da Vinci. It's more just in the style of. And that leads to the second question art historians should ask. What is its style? Now, there's different ways that we can look at style. First, as I just mentioned in this, is the personal style. And this means it's the distinctive manner of individual artists. Now, this can be tricky because there are artists throughout their lifetime who completely change their style of art. If you look at Pablo Picasso, he has different periods in his own style, meaning he completely changed how he did his artwork. Because of this, it can make it hard to attribute something to him based on his personal style. Now, we do have what's called the period style, and these mean characteristic artistic manner of a specific era or span of years, usually within a distinct culture. And we will be talking about many examples of this. In this class, we are going to be focusing mainly on Western art, and we're going to be looking at different styles. So this can include the Renaissance. The Renaissance, as we're going to see, especially the early Renaissance, is a specific time period in a specific location. So the Renaissance, the early Renaissance, is going to start in Florence. Once we get to the High Renaissance, we will move to Rome, and then we'll see that expand throughout Western and Northern Europe. Different examples of this: Baroque, Mannerism, and even more modern works such as pop art, Surrealism. That's an example of a period style. But what makes this difficult is many periods do not have a singular style or they lack unity. And you're going to see that as we go through. An example will be after the Renaissance, we'll look at Mannerism, which was a brief artistic style. And within Mannerism, a lot of the artist's work varies. So we'll see that. Next is what's called regional style, and these are where variations in style are tied together geographically. So, for example, Egyptian art. If we look at ancient Egyptian art, the artworks of that location all tend to have similar characteristics. Another example of this is going to be 17th century Dutch still lifes. The Dutch part of it is again giving us that regional style. All right. The next question the art historian should ask is, what is its subject? Meaning, what's the subject matter? What is portrayed? Usually this encompasses the story or the narrative, the scene presented, the actions, time and place, the persons involved, and the environment. And now what we're looking for here is, again, the subject matter can again give us some hints of when this was created. Because, again, my example of Henry VIII, he would not be a subject of artworks until he actually existed. And when we look at its subject, we also need to explore and look at what's called iconography. This literally means writing of images. So in iconography, it refers both to the content of a work, what we see, and the context of a work, what these objects mean. And iconography is strongly used in religious works. Think of paintings of the Madonna and Child. When we look at that, we can see the content, that it is a mother and the baby Jesus, or a mother and a baby. But we know the context, right? We know what this religion iconography is, that we're not just looking at a mother and a child, but we're looking at two central figures for a tenet of the entire Christian faith. And we can see that also in the work here. On the right, we have the four evangelists. This is a folio, meaning it's from a text, of the Achaean Gospels. This is circa 810. It's ink and tempera on vellum. Vellum is a type of earlier paper, if you will. And so what we see here is we see the four evangelists, meaning these are the four men who are credited for writing the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we can look at them individually and we know who they are. Yet, though, also this iconography and that uses the use of symbols. We can also look at these men and look at the attributes that are with them and also know who they are. So, for example, in St. Matthew has the winged man by him. John is usually associated with the eagle. Mark, the lion. And Luke, the ox. So when we look at these men and we see these symbols with them, that can give us a hint as to who also is shown in the works. Now, this is also true of earlier works. Think of your Greek gods and goddesses. Many of them have some sort of attribute. So Zeus, who is the king, the ruler of all the gods, is often shown with a lightning bolt. And Hera, his wife, his sister wife, she is often portrayed with a peacock. So if we see some sort of Greek female and there's a peacock with her, that attribute usually leads us to think of Hera. And then just the use of symbols within artworks. Here we have personifications, meaning it's some sort of abstract idea that is codified either into human form or into some object itself. So an example here, I have scales. Well, when you see these scales, what do you think of? Most of us would think of the scales of justice. Now, justice is an intangible idea, right? You can't physically create justice. So the scales tend to be a symbol for the idea of justice. Another example of personification, think of in the harbor in New York City. You see this large green lady, right, holding a flame and an open text, right? This is the Statue of Liberty. It's a personification. What is the Statue of Liberty personification of? Liberty and freedom. All right, other questions that need to be addressed. Who made it? Now, what's very interesting is we tend to think that artworks, that we almost always know who the artist is. However, you have to understand there was a large period of time in Western art where artists usually didn't sign their works, and this was done during the Middle Ages. Why? Because the Christian church dominated pretty much all aspects of life at that time, and man was not actually given credit for creativity. What happened is that man was more of just the channel, that artworks were divinely inspired, and so this divine inspiration comes into the human and then they create. So the artists themselves were not important as as an artist, but more just the means of producing the items. And because of this, many of the artworks at the time were not signed by artists. All right, other things. Again, I've already talked about when we say things are attributed to. This means that a work is assigned to a specific artist due to other factors. The work by Da Vinci, we have attributed to him, but there is no 100% credible evidence that it was created by him. And again, this attributed works are subject and often open to doubt. And then also we'll talk about schools. What this means is that this is a group of artists with the same style, usually at the same time and place. So if you hear this was created in the school of Titian, well, that means it could have been created by Titian because it follows some of his same ideas, but most of these famous artists, especially through the Renaissance, often also trained other artists, had apprentices who would do work for them. And so when you hear something like, well, it's in the school of Titian or it's in the school of Raphael, this does not mean that we are saying it is by that individual, but it's by an artist who has the same style at the same time and the same place. All right, and then the last question we should ask as art historians is who paid for it? Now this is where you've heard me use the term patron already. A patron is those who paid artists to make specific works, and sometimes they would employ artists on a continuing basis. The Catholic Church was a major patron, as we'll see, especially during the Renaissance. This was the time period of the Sistine Chapel, the building of St. Peter's. We're going to see Raphael creating the Stanza della Stegnatoria. And so what happens is you have to think about the people who are paying for the works have a very strong influence on a lot of artists. Why? Because if a patron's not happy with a work, perhaps they're not going to pay for it. Or, as your textbook talks about, here we see the bust of Augustus wearing the corona civica, early 1st century CE, and this is marble. Well, the Roman Emperor Augustus, actually lived to the age of 76. However, he insisted that he always be depicted as a young man. Why? Because this is when he physically was his most powerful, and he only wanted to be represented that way. Why? Because he saw himself as the civic, as the government, and he did not want to show any weakness. Another example of this, again, is Henry VIII. We all know the stories of Henry VIII having a violent temper, actually having two of his wives beheaded. And so think if you were an artist who was paid to paint a portrait of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a very, very large man, and many historical accountings have him as not that handsome of a man. Yet, in most portraits, he is shown large, yes, but not grotesque, and also almost always in a very dignified manner. Well, the role of the patron would often influence the artwork. Because think of it this way: you don't want to upset the ruler of the government, who can probably have you killed. All right. So those are just some of the questions as we as art historians should ask, and they're very good questions to get you started looking at a work of art. Now, the rest of the chapter gives you some information and some different terminology. Now, I'm also having you listen to a longer lecture on the elements and principles of composition that will go into more detail, but we will go over some of the terms here. All right, so first, you've already heard me mention a formal analysis. What a formal analysis is, there are many ways of looking at art, but we'll talk about formal and contextual analysis. A formal analysis is where you only look at the object itself, no outside factors. So the image I had here, if we were doing a formal analysis, all we would look at is what's within the frame. We don't worry about the title, the artist, the year, anything, just the object itself. So what things we could talk about with here are the use of color, the use of line, whether it's balanced, whether it's symmetrical, and what that does for the work. So for example, if we were talking about the use of color, there are many bright, bold colors in this work. And maybe we want to make the claim that these bright, bold colors give the work almost a sense of energy, a sense of passion, a sense of happiness to it. Okay? That is the formal analysis. Now, on the other hand, the contextual analysis is all that other stuff. Who created it? When was it created? Why was it created? Who paid for it? Where is it at? What political, cultural, social events were going on at the time? That's the contextual analysis. And a contextual analysis can largely affect how we look at a work of art. Now, for art history, we have to do both. We are not just going to formally analyze art. As we've already mentioned, for art history, it's very important that we know and understand the context. So looking at this painting again, something contextual and how it can completely change how we look at it, look at this and think whether you like it or not. And probably a lot of you are going, well, yeah, it's fine, but probably didn't take a lot of skill to create. Like a 5-year-old could do that, or I could do that. And we all tend to be kind of disparaging to ourselves that we're not good artists, so if I could do it, it's not good art. Well, within this one, once we look at it contextually, we find out it was actually painted by an elephant. And that can drastically change how we look at a work. All right, very briefly, some other terms. Form, this is simply an object's shape and structure. It can be 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. When we talk about composition, we are talking about how an artist arranges or organizes the work. Materials or medium, this is what the art is made from or made up as. And again, also known as the medium or media. And this can be things such as marble, oil paint, wood. Tools, these are the objects that are used to manipulate the medium. Pens, brushes, chisels, hammers, and so on. And then the technique. Technique is a distinctive process artists use to create a work. So if we say, well, such and such uses the lost wax technique, that is a specific technique of creating a type of sculpture. All right, next is line. Line is the basic building block of all two-dimensional design. You cannot create two-dimensional works without creating line. And there are different lines that are mentioned. Your book talks about a contour line, and this is the continuous line that defines an object's outer shape, also known as an outline. There's also what's known as line as edge, and this is where there's a distinction between two shapes or two colors. Here you can see Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night from 1889, oil on canvas. This is a small section of it, but we can see a contour line. If you look along the hills, you see there seems to be almost this solid outline, helping us see that that is a contour line, and that also can be line as edge. Why? It's a distinction between two shapes or colors. Looking at the larger dark object on the left, where we go from the dark paint to the lighter paints, that also is line as edge. And then we also have what's called an implied line. Now this is not a solid line, but it still directs the eye across the work. Usually it shows some sort of movement. So look in the sky itself. The sky itself seems to be swirling and twirling, right? Well, that's not a continuous line that does this. You can see the separate brush strokes, but we have that implied line which kind of draws your eye through the swirls into the right side of the canvas. Now, when most of us look at a work of art, we tend to start to look at the left and move to the right. Why do we do that? Because in the Western world, that is how we are taught to read. So we typically actually tend to read an artwork that way. So when an artwork intentionally draws your eyes to other areas of it, that's usually done very intentionally by an artist to challenge this normal reading of a work. All right. Well, when we talk about color, again, we are going to talk about color, how artists use them. First, which we have is called the spectrum, and this is the discernible wavelength of light. Natural light is actually made up of all the colors. The individual colors can be separated out through what is called a prism. That's where it takes the wavelengths and separates it out. But natural light actually has all the colors. Now, when we as artists use individual colors, what actually is happening is that the colors absorb all the colors in the natural light except the one they reflect. That's what our eye sees as a discernible color. So when something is green, it's absorbing all the other colors and reflecting green, and that is what our eyes see. Your book talks about additive and subtractive. I'm not as concerned that you understand that. All right, when we talk about a hue, that is the individual color. And what you see here is what's called a color wheel. This takes down the discernible wavelengths of light and puts it into a color wheel. We talk about value or tonality. This is the degree of lightness or darkness of a hue. So if we add white to something, it's called adding tint. It makes it lighter. And when we add black to something, it's called adding shade, and it makes it darker. So for all of you who have tinted your windows to make them darker, the terminology is actually wrong. All right? When we talk about intensity, we are talking about the purity of a color. Usually colors that are purely one tone are more intense. When we start to mix colors together, they usually have more vibrancy. Like we can look at them, it's not just like a solid green, but we can see more colors within them. And the more saturated it comes, they actually usually become a little more dull. They're not quite as intense or brilliant. All right, within the color wheel itself, you have three primary colors: red, blue, and yellow. These are primary colors because they are made up of no other colors. Next, you have secondary colors, and these are made up of equal parts of the primary colors. Equal parts of yellow and blue do what? They create green. Blue and red create purple. Red and yellow create orange. Equal parts are secondary colors. Then we have what's called tertiary colors. And these are unequal parts of your primary colors. So for example, here we have what's called blue-green. This is going to have more blue in it than yellow. Okay? And then we have what's called complementary colors. These are hues that are cross from each other on the color wheel. And the human eye tends to naturally see them as going together, hence complementary. Red and green are complementary colors. It's a reason why it's for Christmas. Think of a lot of your sports team. You're going to see that they use complementary colors, not just black and white, and colors that are close to being opposite on the color wheel. Also, what's interesting is when you mix equal parts of complementary colors together, you get gray. All right, color can also affect a work in many different ways. Oh, I forgot one term, palette. When we are talking about a palette in art history, palette is technically that wooden board that artists put the paint on. But when we are talking about a palette, we are talking about the overall color scheme an artist uses in a work. And this color scheme can affect a work in many different ways. So for example, it can affect the mood or feeling of a work. And here I've just given you two very simple examples. Basically, I Googled rainy day painting. The image on the top left, right, we see that it's a rainy day in the evening, yet the colors are very bold, very bright. And so even though we know it's raining out, there's almost this sense of happiness, this sense of warmth from it. Now look at the image on the lower right. This again is a rainy day, and in fact this one's during the daytime, but you probably almost get this sense of like coolness from it. Between the two rainy days, you probably want to be in the one on the upper left. If the one in the lower right had used those same bright, bold colors, it would give the work an entirely different feel. And we're going to see that again in the next couple works. This is a work by Claude Monet, and this is Haystacks. Now, when we look at this, right, if I asked you what feeling you got from this, probably cold, isolation, right? We're looking at a landscape with two haystacks, and it appears as if there are snow on them. Well, then here's by the same author, another Haystacks. Within this one, you get a distinctly different feeling. We have lots of gold tones being used in this, which gives it a sense of warmth. If I asked you what time of year this was, a lot of you might say spring, maybe some of you would say fall, and this one you'd probably distinctly say winter. And it's the colors in the work that help us see this difference. Same subject matter, different colors. Your book talks about this next work. This is Joseph Albers' Homage to the Square. This is a series of works he did in the 1950s. They're all oil on composition board. And what happens within this work? They're different works that have almost concentric squares. Concentric means to share the same center. You can see in this they don't share the same center, but they're all within one another. And what he did throughout this series of works is he used different hues, saturations, and values for each of the square. Each painting is made up of 4 different squares. And what he wanted to show is by the different hues, the different values, the different saturations that were used, that they would all appear very different. So here's an example. Here's the one that's from your textbook. Here's another one. Here is another one. And here's another one. Now, when we look at these, if I go back through them, and you can always pause and fast forward and rewind, if I asked you of the smallest squares out of the 4 paintings, which one was the smallest, you might have different ideas, right? Which one's the largest? A lot of you are probably going to say this one. Which one's the smallest? Perhaps this one. But what's interesting is the squares on all 4 of these are exactly the same size. It's the color that changes how we perceive them. And Albers himself stated, they, meaning the colors, are juxtaposed for various and changing visual effects. Such action, reaction, interaction is sought in order to make obvious how colors influence and change each other. That the same color, for instance, with different grounds or neighbors looks different. Such color depictions prove that we see colors almost never unrelated to each other. So look here. You see that yellow? It's the same yellow as in the center here, yet we probably see these as distinctly different. All right, next, moving on to texture. Texture refers to the surface quality of a work. We have what's called actual, real texture, which means when we run our hand across something, what do we actually feel? So the image on the right, if you ran your hand across this painting, you would feel the lumps and the bumps. This is actually a process that's called impasto, which is the thick application of paint with a palette knife. But then we also have what's called implied texture. Now, implied texture, or perceived or represented texture, this is the texture that we think should be in a work. Yet, if we go run our hand across it, there is no texture, only the smooth texture. So, for example, photographs. Photographs have implied texture. They all have real texture. If you ran your hand across a photograph, you would feel usually a flat, smooth surface. Yet the photograph here of the different bricks, if I asked you what the texture was, a lot of you'd want to say, well, it's rough, almost like gravelly, sandpapery. Yet in this work, that texture is implied. The actual real texture, very flat. An implied texture is important because we're going to see different tools that artists use to create this implied texture within works. The text also talks about, this time it mentions collages. These are works that are made from various materials. Also, they are known as mixed media. All right, very briefly, space, mass, and volume. Space can refer to the area an object takes up or encompasses. It may be real, meaning three-dimensional, or it may be illusionistic. Mass is the actual or implied weight of an object. But volume, this is the weight and shape that can be measured, height, width, depth. Okay? So the two images that we see here, one is a clay vase. If we asked about the space, we could literally take this and measure it if we had the physical object. Now the painting on the right is by Peter Paul Rubens. It's the Disembarkment of Marie de Medici at Marseille, 1622 to 24. Now within this one, we could talk about the different weights within it. There's actually 3 different types of human-like forms. If I asked you of these, which was the lightest, many of you would probably say the form that's floating near the top. Why? We know that things that are floating in the air usually tend to be lighter. Also, the placement of this at the very top makes it appear lighter. The people on the bottom probably appear the heaviest. Why? They look very fleshy, right? We can see the curves of their bodies. If we reached out and touched them, it would probably feel like human flesh. And then the people in the middle, which these are the humans, one of them is Marie de Medici, these people would seem probably in the middle, that they're heavier than the object floating in the air, yet they're lighter than the ones in the bottom. Can we weigh these? No, this is oil on canvas. This is paint. Yet because of these different things, we see the implied mass within a work. All right, next is perspective. And perspective is how we are seeing, where we are seeing something from. And what happens with perspective, it's how forms are organized in a space. And it can give us additional information. Now the text doesn't break it down quite this way, but there's 3 main types of perspective. First is what we have, which is called linear perspective. And this is where we use 2 lines to show a work is receding into space. And you can see that in this painting here. How do we know the road is moving away from us? Because we have these 2 lines and they slightly get closer to one another. Think about train tracks receding in a distance. That is linear perspective. It goes back to some vanishing point on the horizon. The next is what's called atmospheric perspective. This plays on how we as human beings naturally see things. Objects that are farther away from us are usually seen as smaller, out of focus, and often have almost a bluish grayish tint to them. So when we look at this painting here, if I asked you which object's closer, the tree or the house, you're going to tell me the house. Why? Because that's how we tend to naturally see the world. In the painting, the tree is physically bigger than the house, but we wouldn't think if we set them side by side that would be true. We know this is using perspective to show us that the house is further away. And then next is what we call shifting perspective. What happens in shifting perspective is both the foreground and the background are in focus. And what this encourages is this actually encourages the viewer to wander through a work. All right, next we have what's called foreshortening. And this is where we are drastically showing that one part is farther away from another. It's often dramatic and not realistic. And I put this example here because I think it's a little clearer than the one that is used in your textbook. This is the Lamentation of Christ by Andre Magenta. Here what we see, we are standing from our point of view, meaning we as a viewer are standing at the foot of this table or the foot of this bed, and we are looking down at the body of the fallen Christ. Now think about this. If you were standing at the foot of a bed and somebody was laying on it, okay, their feet are towards you, what objects should appear the largest? Well, the feet should, right? The feet are right in front of you. The feet should appear the largest, and everything else should be receding in the back. Yet here we see, like, look at the feet and then look at the legs. The legs appear very, very short. This is what's called the foreshortening. Why? Because what the artist is doing is he wants the viewer to focus on the chest and the face of Christ and not the feet or the legs. So this is where he uses that foreshortening. It's not meant to be a realistic representation, but is a tool that artists use. All right, next, proportion and scale. Very quickly, proportion is how parts in a single work relate to one another. Okay, so if we looked again at this one, we would say this was disproportionate, because imagine how we see it here. If he stood up, he would have very, very little legs and a huge, long torso. Okay? Here you can see that these forms are in proportion. It means that the parts do relate to one another correctly. And basically, this is when it makes sense. Disproportionate works is usually very deliberate, as I showed in the earlier work with the foreshortening, or it's done to purposely cause confusion or chaos within a work. We'll talk about mannerism at one point in the semester, and here we're going to see these very odd proportions being used, and they're being used to actually show this uncertainty of the times themselves. All right, when we talk about scale, we're talking about how different objects relate to one another. So when we say something is built to scale, we're saying it is mathematically related to something else. Other things, imagine in this image here, if the baby was bigger than the man, we would say that's disproportionate. It's also not to scale, right? That the babies are typically smaller than grown men. All right, very briefly, some of the sculptural techniques that we will talk about. When you look at sculptures, you should first look at its dimensionality, meaning is it full round or is it relief? And you should also look at how it's created. Now your book just talks about subtractive and additive. There's really 4 different methods of execution for artworks. The first is subtractive, meaning you have some larger piece of material and things are taken away, or subtractive. This is also known as carving, and you see that here. This is the unfinished statue by Michelangelo, 1527 to 28, marble that is in your textbook. Now, Michelangelo himself often said he did not carve works, that the works were already within the stone and he just freed them. But that's subtractive, taking away. And this can be in marble, granite, wood, metal, subtracting it. Then you have what's called additive, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's adding to a work. The first is what's called construction. Construction builds the form by adding various elements. So the Statue of Liberty, that is something that was constructed. You have many, many different pieces that are put together. Next, you have what's called substitution, also known as casting. This always uses a mold and then adds or substitutes a different material, wax, bronze, or fiberglass. And then we have what's called manipulation. Manipulation or modeling. And this is where you take a material and then you transform it into another form. So pottery is an example of this, where you manipulate it usually using the hands or some other tool and you create it into a different form. All right, the dimensionality of sculptures, we have what's called full round or freestanding. You can see that in the image on the left. This is Michelangelo's David, 1501 to 04, and it is a marble. And think of sculptures in the round or full round. Think of it this way. You can fully walk around them. And so you can see the work as different from various different angles. Now the others, what we have is what's called a relief sculpture. Relief sculptures are in some way attached to their background. They are not full round, meaning you can really only see them from one side. We have what's called a high relief, and this looks at the objects in it are at least half of their depth is projected from the background. And then we have what's called the low or base relief. This means it may even just be slightly raised. And then here's an example from your book of this. This is a relief from the tomb of Hesire within Egypt, the 3rd dynasty. This is actually made from wood. And you can see here the image of like the man. It's just barely raised from the surface, but that is still considered a type of relief sculpture. All right. The textbook then goes into architectural drawings. Read through this, know some of the terminology, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for that. So again, this lecture is meant as more of an introduction. The lecture on the elements and principles of composition is going to go into a lot more detail. I want you to know that more as background, but we as art historians, we're going to focus more on the context, meaning everything else surrounding a work of art.